Mr. Chairman, members, for the record, my name is Glenn Hagar, Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. You have a presentation today, and if you don't mind, we're going to go through the slides kind of quickly, but if I'm going to point you first to the very first page, which looks something like this, and it is titled Revenue Available for General Purpose Spending. For the 2026-27 biennial revenue estimate, shows that the legislature has an estimated $194.6 billion available for general purpose spending for the 26-27 biennium, a decrease of 1.1% from the corresponding amounts of the 24-25 biennium. The total includes an ending balance of $23.8 billion from the current two-year budget period, which ends August 31 of this year. In addition to the $23.8 billion in cash carryover, the 26-27 biennium includes tax revenues of $155.4 billion and non-tax receipts of $21 billion. The $23.8 billion projected ending balance for the 24-25 biennium is robust, but it differs in meaningful ways from the record-shattering ending balance projected in the BRE just 2 years ago. The previous ending balance reflected astonishing revenue growth coming out of the pandemic-related shutdowns, skyrocketing inflation, and an influx of federal money. It allowed you to make critical investments in infrastructure, including broadband, water, higher education, our parks, as well as provide significant property tax relief while maintaining a balanced budget that left money on the table for 26-27. The projected ending balance in this BRE has a different makeup. It reflects conservative fiscal management practices and spending decisions, while other states that reported big balances now are experiencing deficit. It includes unspent contingent appropriations of $4.5 billion for public education and education savings accounts, because as you know, the 88th legislature did not enact the requested legislation. In addition, a full $7.33 billion of balance is due to general related revenue dedicated accounts. This is money that has been collected for specific purposes, but hasn't been spent, allowing it to be considered when certifying the budget as balanced. This estimated ending balance does not account for any revenue-related spending that may be authorized through a supplemental appropriation bill. Additional spending would, of course, reduce the funds available. The ending balance of the 24-25 biennium will be determined by the actions of the 89th legislature and by actual revenue collections during the remainder of this fiscal year. Now, if you actually look at the next page, which is titled Certification Ending Balance, this is just simply to show you very quickly prior ending balances going through back to 2011 session. Now, if you don't mind, the next page, which you can see at the top, is titled Sales Tax and Total Tax Collections. You will recall that our state tax collections soared after the easing of the COVID-related constraints in fiscal year 2022 and 23 to previous levels that had not been seen before in our state. Over the last 28 years, a total tax increases averaged 5.2% per year, yet in fiscal 2022, they increased a record-shattering 25.6% as compared to prior fiscal years. That increase was along with 40-year high record inflation, enormous infusion of federal dollars into the economy, all that contributed to last session's historical cash carryover balances. The Texas economy is projected to grow through fiscal 2025 through 2027, but at a slower pace than what we have had historically. This reflects a returning to more typical economic conditions and ongoing reactions to consumers and businesses to higher interest rates aimed at easing and controlling inflation. About 88% of total revenue-related funds for the 26-27 biennium is projected to come from tax revenues. Sales tax is our revenue system's mainstay. It has made up more than half of the annual state general revenue-related tax collections since 1988. In the 26-27 sales tax collections are projected to be 59% of all total tax collections. It is important to emphasize that our sales tax base is significantly higher than what it was 10 years ago. When I became controller, sales tax collections were less than $29 billion in fiscal year 2015. However, today, they are estimated at almost $49 billion. Thus, an even modest increase in growth can result in substantial amounts of dollars. The next largest sources of general revenue in 26-27 are projected to be motor vehicle sales and rental taxes, oil production taxes, franchise tax, and insurance tax. Now, if you don't mind, I'd ask you to turn to the next page, which, as you can see, this one here, which is titled Oil Production, Prices, and Tax Collections. Oil and natural gas tax collections are the product of two factors. One, price. Second, production. The oil price has fluctuated wildly over the last 20 years, and historically there have been large swings in natural gas prices. Oil production, meanwhile, has experienced a significant change that also affects other parts of our economy. It is no longer tied to rig count. Horizontal drilling and improved fracking techniques now allow companies to produce more oil with fewer rigs. From fiscal 2014 through 2024, the number of active rigs has actually decreased by 65%. Yet oil production during that same period has increased by 92%. This makes oil production more efficient, but it also has a ripple effect on sales tax collections from and employment in the mining sector. With fewer rigs, there's a drop in hiring and purchasing of taxable equipment and other goods related to well development. Looking at severance tax collections, oil prices in 2025 are projected to average $70 a barrel, then rise to $71 a barrel in 2026 and $76 in 2027. Tax revenues will be around $11.8 billion in both the current and the upcoming biennia. Natural gas prices in the 26-27 biennium will slightly rebound based on an increase in power demand from artificial intelligence, data centers, crypto mining, along with a rise in LNG demand. I project that natural gas collections for the 26-27 biennium will grow by 25.5% to be $5.35 billion. Now, if you don't mind, if you turn to the next slide, which you can see says transfers to the ESF, Economic Stabilization Fund, and State Highway Fund. Here you will see that we project a transfer of $5.1 billion from oil and natural gas collections to the State Highway Fund to support our transportation system as required by the Texas Constitution. We will typically would also transfer a similar amount of oil and gas revenues for the Economic Stabilization Fund, or also we call the Rainy Day Fund, but we are going to only send partial allocations for fiscal 2026, and there will be no allocation in 27 because the ESF, the Rainy Day Fund balance, will exceed its constitutional cap from the start of the biennium. By the end of 2026-27 biennium, the Economic Stabilization Fund is expected to grow to be more than $28.5 billion, absent any additional appropriations from that fund. Now, if you don't mind, you can turn to the next page, which is Economic Stabilization Fund ending balances. This page simply shows the ESF balances in fiscal years 22 through 24, estimated balances from fiscal years 25 through 27. In relation to the calculated constitutional cap for the Economic Stabilization Fund balance. As a reminder, the state constitution provision caps the ESF balance at amount equal to 10% of general revenue deposited during the previous biennium. The Rainy Day Fund will hit its cap at the beginning of fiscal 2026 with partial transfers in 2025 severance tax revenue, reducing the amount of money to be transferred and preventing any additional transfers into the fund for fiscal years 2027 and 2028. The total amounts of severance taxes that will be retained in GR is projected to be $5.9 billion in fiscal 2025 and 2027. Thus, the Rainy Day Fund will likely continue hitting its constitutional cap in subsequent biennium from here forward. Please turn to the next page, which looks something like this, which is titled Economic Stabilization Fund Long-Term Forecast. I bring up this page as a policy discussion that needs to be discussed. A question that deserves your attention is whether part of the severance taxes should continue to go into the Economic Stabilization Fund for future generations, or should the cap remain in place, and thus those severance taxes flow back into general revenue from here forward. When the cap is reached, the 37.5% of severance tax collections that are typically set aside for the ESF will remain in general revenue, as well as interest income on the Economic Stabilization Fund cash balance. This chart estimates the projected balance of the rainy day fund due to the constitutional cap and if the cap did not exist, thus allowing severance tax transfers and interest income on the ESF cash balances to remain in the fund. For illustration purposes, the comparison simply runs through 2035. Despite the halt on transfers and interest income, the total ESF balance is projected to grow due to investment income on the invested portion of the fund. This is a result of changes that I pushed for, you approved, to invest the ESF in prudent ways that maintains its purchasing power and liquidity while keeping only 10% of the fund balance in cash or its equivalent. Before this change, we were required to manage the rainy day fund in a way basically that amounted to burying it here on the Capitol lawn. Don't go look, because it's not really there. Additionally, I need to note that as to federal income, I expect that the state will receive $115 billion in federal income along with $70.7 billion in other revenues that are dedicated for specific purposes and therefore unavailable for general purpose spending. Thus, revenue collections from all sources and those all purposes in 26-27 is for a total projection of $362.2 billion. With some new members on the committee, I thought it would be helpful for you to have, for future reference, there's a spreadsheet in your information that shows, that I created several years ago, that shows the volatility in data sales of tax motor vehicle sales, and rental taxes and severance taxes from 96 to the present. So I just wanted you to have that. We're not going to talk about it. The last thing I want to make, as always, I remind you that biennial revenue estimates, as well as our underlying assumptions and projections to make up the BRE, are inevitably affected by events that are outside our control. Texas is not immune to the threats that come from global uncertainties. Wars and unrest in other countries affect our security and put our supply chains at disruption. Here at home, even though inflation is slowing, it will take some time and leadership to address the continued damage effects to our record inflation that we're having. If changes arise in our assumptions and revenues move in different directions than I laid out here before you today, then as always, I will keep you and the taxpayers informed of those changes as we see them. With that, Mr. Chairman, members, I'm happy to answer any questions and whatever your new system of lights is presenting to you on this day.
Hi. Thank you. Representative Rose?
She hit the button first.
Okay.
I was so excited. You were my first question. Oh.
Representative Howard?
Thank you. You get to have me as your first.
All right.
Oh, thank you.
I've had these questions.
I know
what's coming.
You actually covered a lot of it, so.
I did.
Yeah, you
I know
did.
what
Thank
you're
you so
gonna ask.
much. I do want to just clarify again.
Yes.
About the remaining, the $23.8 billion carry forward funds.
Yes.
That several people refer to as surplus. And I think what you're pointing out is that that is there because of a variety of factors, including the $4.5 billion in education that we did not actually send to the schools or to the ESAs. And the dedicated funds, $7.33 billion, can only be used for one specific purpose, but that we decided as voters. But what I also understand, I think you have said, and I just want to clarify, that is available for one-time use.
We can use those dollars, have to be spent by you and appropriated for those specific purposes, but for balancing the budget,
right,
those can be utilized during that time to balance them. And part of that is not just when we certify the budget, but then obviously they can be used for cash flow purposes. But
right,
they can only be spent on that one purpose.
So if we counted it as on the books, there's money there because we did not appropriate it for its purpose, would we be able to use that toward whatever we're spending, knowing, I assume that would kind of consider that debt. You'd have to pay it back. It would be one time.
Yeah,
Because
I
it's
mean,
not
just-
ongoing.
Yeah, just for historical purposes, those GRDs, there have been attempts and efforts to lower those over time, and we have,
right.
but they continued to grow for a variety of reasons, some more than others. However, I can still use them for certification purposes.
So then to clarify again,
Yeah.
it's really not money that is there to be spent on anything in the budget because it's there for one purpose and one purpose only.
It is there for only that purpose, but it still can be
Used to
used
certify
like-
the budget.
Yes, yeah,
And then, so we've got the $4 billion that was for schools, 4.5 billion
Yeah.
that did not get spent. The general dedicated funds that did not get appropriated.
correct.
And then what I have down is that there was $6.6 billion that we supplanted GR funds for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, which is, again, that was a one-time thing. Those were federal funds
Yeah, I was
that
gonna
aren't
make-
coming back.
I was going to make sure he pointed that out, especially for the new members. Those were federal dollars, which significantly a large amount of money came in federal stimulus dollars, whether we agree or disagree after the pandemic, and we could utilize those on specific purposes. The remainder of those funds, y'all decided, and appropriately so, to utilize those over in TDCJ. So obviously, those have to be made back up
Right.
with general revenue or expenditure cuts in TDCJ, which I doubt you're probably
I doubt we're
going
going to do, yes. So with what we just talked about, the $6.6 billion for the TDCJ, the $7.33 billion GRD, the $4.5 billion public education,
Right.
that's $18.4 billion of the $23.8 billion.
That just rolled off your tongue.
Yeah.
It's a
So
lot of
then
money.
I also know we looked at your hearing with the Senate Finance Committee when you
Yes,
were
ma'am.
before them. And if I understood this correctly, the property tax reductions that we made, or relief that we made in the last legislative session, actually ended up costing us $4.7 billion more.
I would have to verify that, the exact number.
Well, so does the ending balance take that into consideration or not?
So if y'all have any supplemental appropriations this session for any adjusted
So that would be
either-
in supplemental?
Yeah, it would be either more expense or less expense. Those are always netted back out.
So that would be, if what I said is correct, that would be more expense that we would need to cover in our supplemental.
Correct.
So there's more there. Okay. So we're really chipping away at that so-called
Yeah,
surplus.
that's the point that
Yeah.
I make, that one or two moves in the state that's this large, this massive, are significant dollars very quickly. And that's the point that I try to make. In part, this is very different than 2 years ago, because what I don't want you to take away from this, that in 2 more years, no matter what you do, there's going to be record cash carryover balances again. Texas is a great state. The economy is strong compared to other places, but don't expect, and that's one part, there's a chart in here that shows the historical averages, because don't expect that. And
Right.
yes, there
Thank
are
you.
large numbers.
And then just real quickly about the ESF.
Yes.
On the chart that you have where you project the future without a cap,
Yes.
what would be coming in, is that also, is that making assumptions about the increase might be in the biennial appropriations because it's based on,
So this, if you're referencing this chart right here, Representative,
I think so.
which is currently with the cap and without the cap, these assumptions are simply what we think the fund will continue to have moved into it without the cap and with the cap, because with the cap, there's nothing moving over there, it's staying in GR. It also assumes interest or investment earning income, so the growth in that's why it moves from the current fund balance. But it's not taking into account any assumptions that you appropriate funds out of the ESF, because I don't know what those would be.
Right.
So I'm trying to make it a
Right.
simple apples and apples
But the
comparison.
cap would be based on the previous bienniums.
It is always, it's
And-
10%.
and is that built into this?
Yeah, this is assuming what that growth would be over time.
The growth in
Yes.
appropriations.
Just kind of historical
Yeah,
averages.
okay. So, 5.6 billion in 26 and 27
Yep.
would spill back over, plus that 307 million from this November's
Correct.
transfer. Spill back over into GR where we have
Correct.
a spending limit.
Correct.
So we may or may not be able to take advantage
is
of it when it
correct.
spills back over
That
to
is
GR.
correct. That is correct.
But indeed, as we have done before with the State Highway Fund, there would be opportunities here perhaps to look at utilizing the money above the cap to create some kind of perpetual fund, maybe for water,
That's correct, yes.
and to seed fund it with that.
That's correct.
And my understanding also is that the rating houses, Moody, Fitch, those, that they look at not only the amount of rainy day fund you have to cover shortfalls in your budget, but also look at, are you using it to invest in infrastructure?
Yeah, part of the issue that I kind of explain is that if not having a state savings account is obviously a knock against you because you don't have a tool in the toolbox that can weather the storm when there's a downturn in the economy, which there's going to be, no matter what.
Right.
We're tied to the global economy. But secondly, if you have a fund and you're never willing to use it, that's a knock against you because it's a tool in the toolbox, but if you're never going to use the tool, it's not necessarily a tool. And so therefore, those are the two kind of examples that I use. So really, it's kind of a common sense between, do you have a fund that actually can utilize during that downturn to smooth out the rough edges, and is it large enough for your state budget? Obviously proportional to the state. But then, if you're never going to use it, you don't get credit for it.
And
so regardless of
yeah.
how you manage it, but the point is, in part, I just try to make as to all of y'all, if you're going to use those funds for ongoing programs, then you're creating up a system that is going to continue to pull money out, rather than, that's why typically, historically here, those of you that are newer, we've either used it for downturns in the economy or we've used it for one-time funding, such as water infrastructure or other types of things.
Is the 10% cap the recommended amount that we should be keeping in? What are the rating houses looking for? What do we need to have in order to?
If I recall correctly, what we did a few sessions ago was trying to, once we started moving money over to the transportation
Yes.
funding, and when does that cut off, and when does it
Sufficient
stay,
balance.
and there was this committee, and so in essence it was tagged to, as long as there's roughly, I think it's 7%,
Right.
if I recall the number.
Yes.
That was a number that I suggested to you as a reasonable number. That's a number y'all went with in policy, but obviously the bigger the tool, the more options you have in the future. And one of the points that I make, obviously I'm not the policymaker. Y'all are the policymaker. I just bring this up because obviously I see the data, I see the numbers. I just think it's important to show and compare and contrast between the two. And back in the 1980s when the ESF was created, it was oil and gas severance tax, but the irony is there was going to be no more severance tax.
Right.
And the Phoenix was reborn.
Yep.
We have this plethora of money coming in, which is a blessing, but at
Yes.
some point it will play out again. That's reality.
So
where do we look at for the future? And that's y'all's choice.
Yeah, no, but I guess what I'm really asking, this is my final question,
Yeah.
is about the percent that is recommended by the rating houses or whomever that we have in a rainy day fund, because as you point out, if you just hoard money, that's also
Correct.
down,
it's somewhere
downgrades
between
you.
those. I mean, it's somewhere in that 7, 8, 9,
Okay.
10%.
Okay,
roughly.
so we have a sufficient balance that we
Correct.
maintain of 7% to transfer to the state highway fund, but we have a cap at 10%, and that appears to be appropriate based on what is standard practice
for this moment in time.
for this moment in time.
But it's
Okay.
also, how do we look to the future?
Thank you very much.
Representative Walling?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Lots of faces trying to see where you're at.
Good morning, sir. How
Good
are
to see you
you?
this morning.
One of your slides talks about the certification ending balance as of August 31.
Yes, sir.
In reference to the ESF.
Correct.
Or, I'm sorry, not the ESF. Ending balances. Last bienniums was
Yes.
historic, is that correct?
Yes.
And it was pushing close to $40 billion.
Yes, sir.
$40 billion.
Yes, sir.
And then you have the historic as of 2011 chart,
Yes, sir.
but the 2023 ending balance, we've never seen that kind of revenue. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then moving forward from the 23 to 25, we still have a surplus, but part of it, is it safe to say that part of that surplus is due to some of the monies that we had from last session? I think that's what Ms.
That is the point that I am making, that we're here at a large surplus for very different reasons. Prior was 3 reasons. Record high revenues into the Treasury, higher than we had ever seen compared to prior years, as you note. Part of that was driven by record high inflation, and then also in top of that was because all the federal money coming down, right, wrong, or indifferent. Now we are here today in part because of your budgeting practices. While the economy's grown, you didn't spend all the money. Even though you did all these record things, you still didn't spend the money.
So part of this surplus, vast majority of the surplus for this biennium is from the monies from.
That is correct.
Right,
And then
so,
some of the reasons that Representative Howard is pointing out, a couple of the other notations I made. Yes, sir.
right, and so, but for those carryovers, we wouldn't have
It wouldn't be
that high.
So the point is, I know I told you it was historical, it was unprecedented, it was a once in a lifetime 2 years ago. I'm trying to stress more than ever, it really is once. Don't expect to have these continued cash carryover balances.
Because we never had them before.
That's right.
And then you mentioned the federal funds, because that was a huge component of it.
Enormous.
And we had several tranches of dollars
That's right.
from
That's right.
2 administrations
That's right.
that sent dollars down. Have we exhausted all those federal dollars already? Or?
If I understand correct, they should be all exhausted by the end of this biennium, and they have to be. That's right, Chairman. They have to be by this biennium.
They're mostly depleted.
Okay, so we're not here, or moving forward, we're not going to be relying on those federal dollars.
No.
Period. Other than what we normally do on
The normal, right? That's right.
Okay. The Economic Stabilization Fund itself, we earn interest on those,
That is correct.
and then we, as a policy.
On all but 10% that has to be cash or cash equivalent. Yes, sir.
Okay.
That was state statute that y'all changed
Okay,
previously.
and I remember when we did that.
Yes, sir.
What is the interest earned on the ESF then?
So there's on the what we call the Testif, I guess if I recall, and I'll have to look at staff to remind me, we've been averaging the last few years 4.8.
Okay.
Now those are not like endowments, which we also have endowed dollars that we're
Right.
entrusted with, and those are more longer term outlooks, which are trying to make a higher rate of return, where these are trying to maintain inflation plus, not the longer reaching higher returns.
So the formula that, you know, that we, and the next slides talk about the, I guess, well, I would say
Which one are you on, Representative?
I am on the Economic Stabilization Fund ending balance, the ESF ending balance, and the cap.
Okay.
I guess as we go forward, money gets spilled over based on some formula, right?
As in back, part of the Economic Stabilization Fund, 37.5% is supposed to go to transportation and into the ESF.
Correct.
But when we hit the cap, then this portion, the 37.5, won't go to the ESF if we're at 10% we're above the 10% of prior biennium tax collections. And so it flows back into, or really just stays in, the state treasury GR.
Okay. And then that, obviously, GR, we can spend as this committee.
As long as you have limits under your spending limits and constitutional limits. Yes.
That's LBB's next. They're coming back up.
Understand. It's
behind you.
complicated.
Yes, but on the interest earned, in the millions, obviously.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes, it's very large amounts of dollars.
Very large amounts of dollars.
It's a very large amount of fund balance.
Right, and so, are they the only ones that we earn interest on? Those funds is GR. Do we earn interest on GR funds as well?
So typically our treasury pool, those dollars are overnight cash investments because they come in and they come out substantially. And for example, we have an enormous amount of them that are going out in the first few months of the biennium because we send as a policy public education 50% of their money in the first 3 months of a biennium. So point being is they're not invested long term, they're overnight cash, but we too try to earn something on them in that overnight cash than zero.
Then what do we do with that interest?
It
dollars?
continues to stay in general revenue.
Okay. And it just carries forward.
You end up spending it.
We spend it.
Yeah.
How
But it's
the-
not substantial amounts of dollars because, again, it's overnight cash and it's moving around, that it's coming in and out of the treasury constantly.
Okay. Back to the sources of the revenue.
Yes.
The first slide is great. I like that one because I can see the, vast majority of our
Right.
revenue sources, sales tax. It's a consumption tax, right?
Yes.
If-
And that's
if-
the mainstay.
And if the sales tax, if we weren't buying stuff and people weren't earning enough income, our budget revenues would shrink.
When the economy contracts, then yes, people don't buy as much. That is correct.
It's just simple.
Yeah, it's
not
simple mathematics.
Okay. And you don't anticipate that we would have another type of budget estimate like last session,
No.
ever?
Where this massive cash
Right.
carryover. No, I do
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, okay.
I've been around for a couple decades and just my crystal ball, which is pretty fuzzy, but I don't see that happening.
Okay. Thank you, appreciate you.
Yes, sir.
All right, Representative Collier?
Oh, no. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I like that question. That was a good question, Representative. Thank you.
All right, members, any other questions for the Comptroller Hager?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members.
Thank you. Yes?
Oh, you got, yes, sir.
Representative Harris.
Go ahead. Yes, sir. Yeah, I can.
We're kind of having coffee with each other this morning. Couple things on the surplus, because we've been talking about that a lot. And I've heard you reference a lot of things, historic cash carryovers,
Right.
record high inflation,
Yep.
large dollars coming from the federal
Fed.
government. To simplify this, though, for folks coming home, I mean, the ultimate originating source of these funds are taxpayers.
Taxpayers pay all of these on this chart right here.
Yep.
Yes, but there are contributing factors as to why people pay more or less taxes.
That's right. And so,
And yes, we pay taxes to the federal government. Those funds come back to the state in certain amounts. There were
Yep.
larger amounts than ever after post-COVID. That's the
correct.
point.
No, and I appreciate that, because of course, for the federal government to have dollars, they had to tax
That's
people, right? And then also, same thing though, when we're talking about record high inflation, the implication there is things cost more,
Yeah,
therefore
the-
6.2 or 8.25.
The simple point that I make is that if you bought something for $100 last year and you paid 6.25, as in the state portion, not the local portion, and then this year after inflation you pay 110, you would think, oh, 6.25 on $10 didn't add up.
Yeah.
It added up.
Yeah.
It really added up during that post-COVID ramp up in spending.
Right. So we have all this excess from those sources, which ultimately originated with the taxpayers. So effectively a surplus, I know it might be a slight oversimplification, but the point would remain that we have a surplus because we have overtaxed citizens above and beyond what we need for the maintenance of government operations. Is that
I think
largely right?
when you look at budget after budget, I don't disagree that's a way to look at it.
Yeah.
But when there's anomalies in large amounts of money, and when
Yeah.
you go up essentially 25% in total tax collections from one year to the previous, that has never happened in Texas history. And so therefore, the point is, each of you that were sitting here didn't make a conscious decision, oh, we're gonna overtax people by 25%. I mean, it was these massive anomalies. So, how do you adjust that going forward?
Yeah.
Whether that was property tax reduction, whether it's water infrastructure funding, or whatever you did last session, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. And the questions weren't to the point of
Yeah.
intention or
Yeah,
motivation,
no, I understand.
just the
Yes.
effect.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Want to go back, I'll actually want to stay on the surplus for a second, because there's been a lot of talk about the dedicated funds, which, as an aside, and if you feel like opining on it, I understand you're not the policymaker here, we are, but I mean, maybe I'll start, I'll have two questions, you can answer them in whatever order you want. I mean, is this something that the legislature should start considering, whether it actually makes sense to have such a high percentage of these revenues in dedicated funds, given A, the fungibility of dollars, two, your ability to still utilize them for certification purposes of the budget? So that's sort of one piece of it. And then I guess the second, maybe that's easier for you, is your math. Just how much of the budget surplus would you say is available for purposes of property tax relief?
So that last one is up to y'all's decision. Not going to get into that. The fact is, obviously, I have heard about property tax for a long time.
Yeah.
That's one that continues to be, even though the state is constitutionally prohibited from collecting a property tax.
Yeah.
We don't collect any pennies, but that's all we talk about, because obviously that's an important issue for all the constituents. So, you know, the appropriate amount is y'all's decision, but prior to, on GRDs, general revenue dedicated accounts, as we're talking about, those have been something the legislature has really, I want to say, struggled with, tried to figure out how to right-size that. I will give, for example, TERP, emission reduction, is the largest piece of that. If you don't collect it, you're penalized by the federal government because you have to collect it, but there's only so many things you can utilize it for, and so that fund has actually grown. And so that's the biggest piece, is my point.
Right.
The legislature, back several speakers ago, when Speaker Strauss was here, that was one of his top issues over and over and over.
Yeah.
Those were brought down. We got rid of several GRDs, but even though there's been attempts to reduce them and bring them down, certain reasons they've gone back. So my point is, I think it is something you continue to look at and try to figure out how to right size that, because they are continuing to grow.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like that game of whack-a-mole, to try to get it down, and thought it was going forward, and then here we go back up.
No, it just seems like something, and from my perspective, the legislature may want to give more consideration to, and I think you're
and
more
I
or less
think
confirming that.
Yes, sir.
Back to the first question, though, how much would be available? Because, I mean, we've got the surplus, I'm looking at it right here, 23.76. If the legislature was hell-bent on maximizing property tax relief, because you are correct, the state of Texas does not come in and collect property tax levies. But if we were hell-bent on maximizing the dollar amount that we put into however we do it, exemptions, compressions, and maybe I'll ask you a question about that in a second, but is there anything that would preclude us from using 23.76?
Oh, you could use every penny on any type of issue in the budget.
Thank you.
But the question is it going to be here next session to actually do it again?
No,
whether you do that in health and human services and transportation funding, property tax reduction, the question is it there in 2 years to do it again? Because once you make the commitment, it's on you.
That's correct, and certainly the ongoing concern nature of the questions doesn't elude me in asking it. I'm just wondering sort of what is the the maximal production possibility frontier if we wanted to throw all of it at property tax relief? We could do it, right?
Well, I think you can do a lot of things,
right? But we could do it.
Well, you can also jump off the roof. But I mean, I'm not trying to play a game.
No,
I'm just
I
trying
don't
to make a point. That's why y'all are the policymakers.
And that's why I'm asking you just say an objective, like a subjective, or I should say a positive, not a normative question. It's a positive question.
Understand.
Non-normative. Okay. On the rainy day fund, you mentioned a couple options of what we could consider doing given the dollars that are flowing into it. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, if I heard you correctly, I scribbled down, we could remove the cap or continue sending more to GR. Those are two options you laid out for us. But one option I didn't hear, but I want to make sure that we could consider a third option, which would be to reduce severance taxes.
Yeah, you can do that too, which I know is going to get brought up. So that's also one option.
Right. Because, I mean, right now the ESF is funded pretty heavily on the backs of our oil and gas sector. And any option to provide relief to them,
principally where the revenues come from.
That's right. Because one thing also we could do that I didn't hear mentioned, but just want to make sure we're not precluded from it. I mean, when we experience economic downturns, we could also cut spending to combat the pressures from the revenue side, right?
Of course, government can decrease just as much as anything
I just want to make sure,
else.
because I don't hear that talked about a lot. Since I've raised homestead exemption versus compression, just curious if you do have an opinion on that. That's a big discussion down here. Do you know, but again, not what we should do, but from your share, because you've got the data,
right.
Do you know if one versus the other, increasing homestead exemptions versus increasing rate compression, which one would have a benefit towards a greater number of Texans?
Yeah, I didn't look at that before I came, and I haven't looked at that for a while.
Could I follow
We're
with
happy to play a role in that.
Yep.
As we go through this session to help y'all figure out where that lands.
Okay. One other question related to data, because you mentioned the property tax relief, or somebody here did, in 23 that we did last session, as it was heralded by many as the largest property tax cut in Texas history. Do you know, in the subsequent years since that was passed in 2023, did property tax revenue go up or down in the 2 years since then?
I don't have that in front of me. I think historically, property tax revenues have continued to move up, but also every morning when you wake up in the state of Texas, there's another 1,600 people that call Texas home today.
Absolutely.
They did yesterday. So the point is, the economy continues to grow, the state continues to grow, assets are built on the ground which have improved values, and so that portion continues to grow. So my guess is pretty much every year it's continued to go up. I think there's
Yeah.
only 1 year, if I recall correctly, that property tax values in the state were essentially flat.
Yeah, and the
Only
reason I asked,
1
I
year
thought
in
I
the
had,
last
thought I had seen data
40
come out
decades.
from the Comptroller. So I don't have it on
Yeah,
me either, but
yeah.
I can follow up with
Yeah,
you on that
yeah,
one too.
yeah.
And then just, I guess in closing, one point of clarification. One of my colleagues mentioned this 4.5 billion from last session that wasn't allocated towards public
Right.
education. I do think it bears noting that wasn't sent down to the schools because a coalition of folks in the minority party and anti-school choice members of the majority party refused to allocate even $500 million for school choice. So I think that clarification needs to be noted. But thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.
Representative Berry?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hagar. Thank you so much for
Yes,
coming
sir.
out today. I appreciate all the information. It was very helpful.
We'll
I'm-
send you a quiz later.
Yeah, please do. I'm going to move from more subjective to more substantive here. So just to kind of recap, the 23.76 billion surplus, fictitious, I'd say, necessarily, but it's carryovers, right?
That's correct.
We have $4.5 billion for schools, 6.6 billion for criminal justice, and 7.3 for dedicated funds.
Right.
Right. Explain to me a little bit about, and these are factual things, right? Definitive definitions, right? You said that 10% of our annual budget goes, or the tax collections goes to the ESF, right?
Well,
Annually.
as long as the ESF fund balance is of a level that is lesser than 10% or more. If it's lesser than that, then part of the ESF money can continue to move over there, as in severance tax collections, I'm sorry, can continue to move over there. That's the formula.
And roughly you mentioned is like a 4%, I guess, rate of return,
Yeah.
roughly.
Plus, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay,
correct.
So
Yes.
on that fund.
On this, the vast majority, but we have to keep 10% in cash equivalent, is what state statute requires today.
And last but not least, spending caps. You mentioned spending caps a few times. Can you go over some of are there various spending caps, or is there just one spending cap that you're referring to?
So they're one, first and foremost, typically, the amount of revenue that we estimate will come into the state treasury, you can't spend more than that. Typically, that is the predominant limit. You can't spend more than what we are estimating that you bring in. But then there are times when that plus the cash carryover is of such amount that then it falls to other spending limits that you have to live within. And those are calculations that are made. The legislature makes the decision before session. Population inflation growth, I don't remember what that exact rate was this session, but then that's the limit. So there's typically two limits. The one that typically applies is you don't get to the second one.
Yeah.
But it does this session, and it did last session.
And our next presentation will be on the spending limits.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm out. See you. Bye.
Right. Thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate you.
Anytime.